1935, a WPA photographer named Russell Lee drove a government-issued Ford through the hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, documenting what poverty looked like at the bottom of the American century. He took hundreds of photographs, gaunt men on porches, children with bare feet and enormous eyes, women hanging wash in the gray light between mountains so close together they nearly touched the sky. One of those photographs became famous. You may have seen it reproduced in textbooks. A mother and 3 children sitting on the steps of a collapsed outbuilding. The woman's face carrying the particular exhaustion that doesn't come from a single hard week, but from a hard life. Stacked on a hard childhood, stacked on ancestors who had never known anything else. In the background of that photograph, barely visible through the tree line, there is a faded wooden sign nailed to what remains of a collapsed structure. Most people who look at the photograph never notice it. The subjects are too compelling. But if you lean in close, and you have to lean in quite close, you can read it. Yates School, established 1891. Nobody asked about the sign. Not the photographer. Not the editors at the Farm Security Administration who processed the film. Not the academics who later used the image to illustrate the failure of Appalachian development programs. The sign was background, scenery, context. But that sign has a story, and that story does not make for comfortable reading. What happened at Yates School between 1891 and 1894 is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, not because the records don't exist, but because the people who made the records believed with absolute sincerity that they were doing something good. That is often how the worst things happen. Not in secret, not in shadow, but in broad daylight, in a one-room schoolhouse, in the handwriting of a woman who considered herself a progressive. Her name was Prudence Yates. She was 31 years old when she came to McDowell County. She had a college education from the State Female Seminary in Wheeling. She had read Francis Galton. She had read Herbert Spencer. She had attended lectures on what the educated classes of the 1880s called social improvement. She came to teach, and she did teach. That was the worst part. She was extraordinary at it. What happened in those 32 months in McDowell County destroyed more than a school. It fractured families that had been bound together for generations. This is that story. We know what Prudence Yates thought because she wrote it down, prolifically. She kept a detailed personal journal. She wrote letters to her sister Catherine in Charleston, and she submitted quarterly reports to the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions, the organization that had placed her in McDowell County under their Appalachian Education Initiative. Those quarterly reports are models of professional restraint, careful, optimistic, filled with enrollment numbers and reading progress and testimony to God's grace working through literacy. They are exactly what the Board of Home Missions wanted to read. They tell you almost nothing about Prudence Yates. The letters to her sister are different, and the journal, which Prudence believed was entirely private, which she believed would never be read by anyone in McDowell County, which she stored locked in the bottom drawer of her writing desk. The journal is something else entirely. We begin with the letters. March 14th, 1891. From Prudence Yates, Elk Creek Hollow, McDowell County, West Virginia, to Miss Catherine Yates, 14 Broad Street, Charleston, West Virginia. My dearest Kath, I have now been 3 weeks in this most extraordinary country, and I find I must write to you at length, for there is so very much to describe, and I confess I am still trying to make sense of my own impressions. The mountains are simply staggering, Kath. You cannot imagine. Coming up from the rail terminus at Welch on the timber company's supply wagon, I felt as though the land itself was folding up around me. Great dark ridges on either side, the creek running alongside the track, the hemlocks so enormous and so old that they seem less like trees than like the columns of some vast cathedral that has been left unfinished since the beginning of time. It is humbling in a way that nothing in Charleston ever was. The people here are equally extraordinary, though in a more complex fashion. They are genuinely, sincerely kind. There is a generosity of spirit here that I confess I did not expect. The Eustace family, in whose home I am boarding, a widow named Hester Justus and her 4 children, have given me the only proper bedroom in the house and will not hear of taking a cent more than the $4 monthly I insisted upon. Mrs. Eustace pressed a jar of preserved blackberries into my hand my very first night and seemed almost offended when I attempted to thank her. The children are charming in their simplicity. They arrive at the schoolhouse in such a variety of states, some in reasonable clothing, others quite ragged, but they all come, which is itself a kind of miracle, as I gather previous teachers had considerable difficulty with attendance. There are 17 currently enrolled, ranging from 6 to 15 years of age, and I have already identified several who appear to possess genuine native intelligence, which delights me. The school building itself required some attention. The previous teacher, a Mr. Garland who lasted only 1 winter, I'm told, had made no improvements, and the roof leaks in 2 places. The men of the Hollow repaired it within a week of my asking, which speaks well of the community's investment in the enterprise. I am working on a curriculum plan. Reverend Pike, who oversees the mission, has asked only that I teach reading, basic arithmetic, and scripture, but I intend to do considerably more than that. These children deserve geography, natural science, composition. They deserve to understand the world they live in. That is what education is for. Write soon, dear. Tell me all the Charleston gossip I am missing. Your loving sister, Prudence. Now here is what that letter does not say. It does not say that in the same week she wrote it, Prudence had already begun a separate, private document. Not her journal. That came later. This was a more clinical record. She called it, in her precise schoolteacher's hand, Observations on the Intellectual and Hereditary Characteristics of the McDowell County Pupils, Spring Term, 1891. She had divided a ledger book into 2 columns. The left column bore the heading she borrowed from the vocabulary of Francis Galton, whose work on hereditary genius she had studied at seminary under a professor who considered it the most important scientific advance of the century. The heading was Improvable. The right column bore the heading Terminal. She had already begun filling in names. The hollow that held Elk Creek was the kind of place that could make a person believe in God without any additional argument being required. In April, when the redbud trees came into bloom along the creek banks and the service berries opened white against the still bare hardwoods above them, the whole hollow turned briefly, improbably beautiful, pink and white and silver gray against the charcoal ridgelines, with the creek running clear and high from snowmelt, churning white over the limestone shelves that crossed its bed every 100 yards or so. Hester Eustace, who had been born in this hollow and had buried her husband Caleb here 3 years prior, when the timber company's skidder chain snapped and took him across the chest, still found herself stopped some mornings on her way to the spring house, just standing there holding her empty water bucket, looking up the ridge at the light coming through the leaves. Caleb had called it God showing off. She thought of him every time. Her 4 children, Silas, 14, Opal, 12, Thomas, 10, and little Della, 6, had grown up in this hollow the way children grew up in hollows, which is to say, they knew every inch of it, every animal trail and mushroom bed and swimming hole, every family within 3 miles and the full history of their disputes and alliances and bloodlines. Silas could read a weather sign on the ridge as accurately as any man in the county. Opal could name every plant in the surrounding forest that was edible or medicinal, a knowledge she'd inherited from Granny Deal, who had more or less adopted her as an informal apprentice when Opal was 7. Thomas was quiet and watchful and had a gift for drawing that expressed itself in charcoal sketches on whatever flat surface came to hand. Fence boards, slate rocks, the inside covers of the family Bible. They were, all 4 of them, children in possession of real intelligence. It expressed itself differently in each of them, shaped by the particular demands of their world. But it was there. Anyone paying attention could see it. Prudence Yates was paying attention. She was just paying attention to something very specific. The school opened for its spring session on the first Monday of April, 1891. Prudence had spent the preceding 2 weeks cleaning and reorganizing the schoolhouse, a single room of rough-hewn poplar planks, with a pot-belly stove at one end, a blackboard that had been a genuine luxury when it was installed 8 years earlier, and was now chalked nearly to illegibility, and rows of crude benches that had been built by fathers and uncles and grandfathers of the current students. The benches had no backs, the windows had no glass, only wooden shutters that let in light, but also every draft and insect the season provided. Prudence had written to the Presbyterian Mission Board for supplies. To her genuine surprise, they came. Crates of McGuffey readers in various levels, a box of slates and slate pencils, maps of the United States and of the world, a globe that was slightly dented but still entirely functional, and, most precious of all, a small collection of books, a children's natural history, a simplified geography text, a book of simplified science experiments for school use. When she unpacked these materials and arranged them on the shelves she'd had Silas Eustace help her build along the back wall, she felt something she could only describe as righteous satisfaction. This was going to matter. These children were going to have something real. She was not wrong about that. She was very wrong about what that something real would cost. The first weeks of the spring session were, by every account that survives, genuinely remarkable. Parents who came to deliver their children stood in the schoolhouse doorway and stared at the new books, the globe, the maps pinned neatly to the wall. A man named Seth Vance, Henry's father, a broad-shouldered man who'd worked every kind of timber job there was and could neither read nor write beyond his own name, stood looking at the globe for a long time without speaking. "Is that the whole world?" he asked finally, very quietly. "That's the whole world," Prudence confirmed. He turned it slowly with one finger, watching the blue and brown and green spin under his touch. "Lord," he said. Just that. Lord. Prudence smiled, and she wrote in her report to Reverend Pike that evening. The community response has been most encouraging. I believe the appetite for learning here is genuine. What she wrote in her private ledger was different. Cephas Vance, laborer, examined his son Henry today. Strong vocabulary for his age, quick retention, good spatial reasoning as demonstrated by his immediate comprehension of the globe's proportional geography. Father shows zero academic comprehension, but strong emotional response to visual stimuli, consistent with the literature's description of arrested development in non-literate populations. The son is clearly an improvement on the father. Whether this improvement is the result of hereditary luck or environmental exposure remains to be determined. We'll observe. The literature she referenced was not the McGuffey reader. The children, for their part, were initially shy and then rapidly enthusiastic. Prudence was the first teacher they'd had who seemed genuinely interested in what they thought, who asked questions rather than simply demanding recitation, who, and this mattered enormously to them, did not seem to find them amusing. Previous teachers had occasionally let slip a certain condescension, a smile when dialect words surfaced, a barely perceptible pause before accepting an answer delivered in mountain speech. Prudence did not do that. She listened to their answers with complete attention, her dark eyes fixed on the speaker, nodding as they talked. She was doing something more complex than listening, of course. But the children didn't know that. Opal Eustace discovered, in those first weeks, that she loved geography, the way she had previously loved mushroom hunting with Granny Deal, with the same sensation of pieces fitting together, patterns revealing themselves, the world making sense in new configurations. She would sit after school had dismissed, when the other children had gone home to their evening chores, and trace her finger along the map of Europe while Prudence worked at her desk. "What's it like there?" Opal asked once, pointing to Italy. "Warm," Prudence said, without looking up from her papers. "Mountains there, too, in the north. Hot summers. They grow olives and grapes." "Are there poor people there?" A pause. "Yes. Like here?" "Somewhat." Prudence set down her pen. She regarded Opal with that complete, weighing attention. "Though poverty is not precisely the same everywhere, Opal. Poverty in Italy is an old poverty, built up over many centuries of a certain kind of society. Poverty here is—" She paused again, choosing her words in a way Opal would not understand until she was much older, choosing them carefully because she was simultaneously expressing something she believed and concealing something she believed more deeply. A more recent circumstance, more potentially reversible. Opal nodded, not fully understanding, and went back to tracing the Alps. In her ledger that evening, Prudence wrote, "Opal Eustace, F.E. 12, improvable, strong geographic intuition, abstract reasoning above grade level, genuine intellectual curiosity, as opposed to mere desire to please. She asks questions that are not prompted by my lesson structure. This is the distinguishing marker. The unchosen merely answer. The improvable ask. Transfer her to the advanced reader by next week." Silas Eustace did not ask questions. This was not because he lacked them. It was because at 14 he had already developed the mountain teenager's particular wariness of being caught wanting something, of reaching for something, and being noticed reaching, and then having it taken away or laughed at. He was lean and quiet, and had his father's dark eyes, and he did the arithmetic on the chalkboard faster than any child in the room, with a self-effacing speed, as if completing it quickly would let him become invisible again sooner. Prudence noticed the speed. She did not notice what was behind it. In her ledger, the entry for Silas reads, Silas Eustace M. Cro, 14, mechanically quick with computation, rote memory strong, but when pressed beyond the rote, shows limited creative application, asks no questions, does not initiate. The computational speed is likely artifact of counting timber volume with the father in the years before father's death. Practical mathematics, not genuine mathematical reasoning. Compare to Henry Vance, who makes computational errors, but demonstrates genuine problem-solving instinct. Provisionally, terminal, will confirm over next 2 months. She confirmed it in 3 weeks. She had made up her mind. The decision she had made, the decision that would define everything that followed, was not dramatic. It did not feel from the inside like a decision at all. It felt like observation, like science. Francis Galton had proposed in his 1869 work, Hereditary Genius, that intellectual ability was fundamentally inherited, that the distribution of genius and dullness in a population was as fixed as the distribution of height, and that the great task of a progressive society was to identify and encourage the reproduction and advancement of the superior hereditary strains, while discouraging, through whatever social mechanisms were available, the proliferation of the inferior ones. He called this science eugenics, from the Greek for well-born. He was Charles Darwin's cousin. He had impeccable credentials. His ideas were not fringe. They were mainstream. They were fashionable. They were published in respected journals and taught in respected institutions. Prudence had not read Galton as a radical. She had read him as confirmation of things she already believed. She was a woman of her time, educated, progressive by 1891 standards, genuinely committed to social improvement. She believed, completely sincerely, that some people were capable of advancement and some were not, and that the scientific, compassionate, efficient thing to do was to identify which was which and allocate resources accordingly. She was not cruel. She was, in her own estimation, deeply rational. She was also, in ways she could not see, because they were built into the very structure of her thinking, catastrophically wrong about almost every premise underlying her approach. But she was an excellent teacher for the children she had decided to teach. April 29th, 1891. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates have completed my initial assessment of all 17 enrolled students. Summary findings. Improvable. Those who demonstrate heritable intellectual capacity warranting full educational investment. Opal Justus, 12. Henry Vance, 13. Mattie Crum, 11. Ezra Deal, 9. Luella Ferris, 10. Terminal. Those whose heritable limitations suggest that advanced educational investment will produce minimal return and may actually do harm by elevating expectations beyond biological capacity. Silas Justice, 14. Thomas Justice, 10. Della Justice, 6. Too young to assess reliably, but physical assessment suggests limited neural development. Very small head, poor motor coordination, Clem Crum, 13, Butch Ferris, 12, Orville Vance, 11, Flora Deal, 8. Unassessed, insufficient data. 5 additional students whose attendance has been too irregular to permit confident classification. The proportion of improvable to terminal is approximately 1 to 2. 2. Higher than I expected given the documented hereditary isolation of these communities, but consistent with Galton's observation that even severely restricted breeding populations maintain some proportion of superior heritable stock. Moving forward. All classroom instruction will nominally serve all students. I will not make my system visible, as this would create unnecessary conflict, but all supplemental attention, advanced materials, encouragement, and long-term planning will be directed exclusively to the improvable group. The terminal students will receive competent basic instruction, sufficient to maintain their attendance and their parents' goodwill, and nothing more. This is not cruelty. This is allocation of limited resources according to the most rational calculus available. A physician with 10 doses of a scarce medicine does not distribute them equally among the dying. He gives them to those with the best prognosis. This is the same principle. God forgive me if I am wrong. I do not believe I am wrong. She was not wrong about her method. She was phenomenally good at what she did, and she did it so subtly, so consistently, so professionally, that even people who were watching closely, and eventually some people were watching closely, could not easily explain why certain children bloomed and others wilted. But the effects were visible, even in that first spring term. By June, Opal Justus was reading at a level that Prudence privately estimated as equivalent to a 9th grade student in a city school. She had worked through the advanced McGuffey reader and moved on to the natural history text, and then to a battered copy of a simplified geography Prudence had brought from her own library. She was writing compositions of 2 and 3 pages in a careful hand, with a vocabulary that was evolving week by week, absorbing new words the way dry ground absorbs rain, immediately and completely. Prudence encouraged this, praised it. She stayed after school, with Opal 3 afternoons a week. She brought additional books from the Mission Board's library at Welch. She wrote to the Mission Board, recommending Opal Justus as a child of remarkable native intelligence, whose advancement should be the board's primary concern in this district. By June, Thomas Justus had stopped raising his hand. This was less dramatic to observe. Children stop raising their hands for all kinds of reasons: shyness, embarrassment, the gradual realization that another student always answers faster. But there was a pattern to it that Granny Deal, who was not a woman who missed patterns, began to notice over the summer. She saw Thomas at the creek one afternoon, sitting on a limestone ledge with a piece of slate and a nail, drawing something, a detailed rendering of a red-tailed hawk she'd watched circle the hollow that morning. The drawing was extraordinary. The proportion was perfect. The posture captured something about the bird that a photograph might have missed. The contained tension of a creature always poised to become motion. "Thomas," she said, sitting down on the ledge beside him. "That's beautiful work." He shrugged, kept drawing. "Does Miss Yates know you can do this?" A longer pause. His hand continued to move, the nail scraping the slate. "She says drawing's not useful learning," he said. Granny Deal looked at the hawk, at the boy's hand. "She said that to you direct?" "She said it to Della when Della was drawing in class." He blew the slate dust away and looked at his work. Della cried. Granny Deal filed this away. She was not a woman who acted on incomplete information. The summer term brought new dynamics to the Hollow. The timber company, the McDowell Lumber and Land Company, a subsidiary of a Baltimore investment firm, had expanded its operations further up the Creek Valley, pushing its rail spur 3 miles closer to Elk Creek. This brought new workers into the territory. A crew of Italian laborers who were cutting for the skidder operation, some Hungarian miners' families who'd migrated from the coal counties to the south, and a Welsh foreman named Owen Davies who ran the main cutting operation with a precision that earned grudging respect from the mountain men who'd watched their own forest turned into someone else's profit. The foreman of the Italian crew was a man named Giacomo Ferretti. He was 43 years old, heavy-set, with a dark beard just beginning to go gray at the jaw, and a permanent expression of careful attention that made him appear perpetually skeptical. He had come to America from the Piedmont region of northern Italy in 1882, following a brother who had already established himself in the Baltimore importing business. Giacomo had not found importing to his taste. He had found timber, the physical certainty of it, the way the work was always honest about what it demanded of you, the way the land itself kept score. He had worked his way up from swamper to crew foreman over 9 years. He had seen, in his 9 years in American timber camps, a great deal of how the American class system operated in practice, which is to say, he understood clearly that the men at the top of every hierarchy believed the men below them deserved to be there. This belief was so universal, so casually held, that it had stopped being remarkable to him. What was remarkable, when it appeared, was the reverse. A man at the top who did not believe this, who saw the hierarchy as contingent, temporary, built rather than born. He had also, in Italy as a young man, attended a workers' education congress in Turin, where a lecturer had spoken about what was then being called the science of heredity and its application to the organization of labor. The lecturer had been describing it admiringly. Giacomo had listened and then had walked out and had never gone back to that kind of meeting. He understood the theory very well. He understood what it was for. He noticed Prudence Yates in early June at a community gathering held in the field above the schoolhouse, a kind of end-of-spring term celebration that the mission had encouraged as a way of building community investment. She was standing with Opal and Henry and Maddie Crum, the 3 improvable students who had flourished most visibly, showing them something in a book. The children were animated, leaning in. 15 feet away, Silas Justice was splitting wood. He had been asked to split wood for the cooking fire. He was doing it efficiently, without complaint. He was also, Giacomo noticed, glancing toward the group with the book about once per minute, very quickly, as though checking something? As though watching a door he was not allowed through. Giacomo had seen that look before. He knew what it meant. He kept watching. July 3rd, 1891. From Prudence Yates, Elk Creek Hollow, McDowell County. To Miss Catherine Yates, 14 Broad Street, Charleston, West Virginia. Dear Kath, your last letter made me laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. The story about the Callaway wedding was exactly the kind of Charleston absurdity I needed to hear. How extraordinary that a woman can have a 7-layer cake and still manage to cause a scene. Things here proceed well. Better than well, honestly. The progress the children have made this spring exceeds anything I was prepared to expect. I have one student in particular, a girl named Opal, who I believe could, with proper development, achieve genuine scholarly distinction. She has a quality of mind I rarely encountered, even among my most promising students at the seminary preparatory program. The community is warm, and the mountains remain extraordinary. The timber operations have expanded nearby, which brings a certain noise and disruption, and the influx of foreign workers creates some social friction. The Italian crew is industrious, but there is an inevitable cultural distance. One of their foremen, an Italian named Ferretti, has been surprisingly communicative. He speaks better English than I expected, and seems to possess an unusual degree of what I can only call cosmopolitan awareness for a man of his class. He occasionally joins the community gatherings on the weekend. I cannot quite work out what he makes of the school program, as he asks questions rather than making statements, a habit I generally find admirable, but in his case slightly unnerving, as his questions have an oblique quality that makes me suspect he is getting at something he hasn't yet said directly. I suppose I'm being paranoid. He is a laborer, after all. Write soon. Your Prudence. Prudence Yates was not, in fact, being paranoid. Giacomo Ferretti was indeed getting at something he hadn't said directly. He was still gathering information. He watched through the summer. He watched the way Prudence distributed her attention in the mixed-age sessions that continued through June and July. How she would spend 40 minutes working through natural philosophy with Opal and Henry and the other chosen few. Then assign the rest a copying exercise, while she continued the advanced work as though the copiers had ceased to exist. He watched how she managed her praise, dispensing it to the improvable students in a warm, individualized, specific way, and offering the unchosen group a generic, slightly flat approval that was technically encouragement, but felt, he imagined it felt if you were a child, like being patted on the head. He watched Silas Eustace most carefully. Silas was doing what Prudence had assigned him, which was increasingly physical work around the schoolhouse, repair tasks, hauling, the chopping of wood. He did it without complaint. He attended school when sessions were held. He sat in the back of the room. He did his arithmetic quickly and quietly, and showed nobody. Giacomo had a son back in Baltimore, a boy of 17 who was working in his uncle's business and doing well. He had put that son in the best school he could afford, in the Italian neighborhood in South Baltimore, and the boy had done well there, and Giacomo thought about him sometimes when he watched Silas Eustace, the parallel paths, the different luck. In August, he sat down next to Silas at a community gathering and asked him, directly and simply, what he liked to study. Silas looked at him for a moment with the particular wariness he had for adult attention. Arithmetic, he said. What kind? Another pause. The kind where you figure things out, not just compute, where you figure something you didn't know before from things you do know. Giacomo nodded slowly. Like an engineer. Silas shrugged, not knowing what an engineer was, not wanting to admit it. I have some books, Giacomo said, from the engineering crew. They do calculations for the rail spur placement, gradient calculations, load distribution. Would you want to see them? Silas said yes before he'd finished deciding whether to say yes. It came out of him the way water comes out of a cracked pipe, under pressure, unstoppable once the crack appeared. Giacomo brought him the books the following week. Silas read them by firelight, lying on the pallet he shared with Thomas, Thomas asleep beside him, the whole hollow quiet except for the creek and the owls. He did not tell Prudence about the books. He understood, without anyone telling him, that this would be unwelcome information. September 6th, 1891. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates' fall term begins Monday. Summer has confirmed my spring assessments with only minor revisions. Ezra Deal has been reclassified from improvable to terminal. Following a series of sessions that revealed his spring performance was largely mimicry rather than genuine comprehension. Flora Deal, conversely, shows unexpected vocabulary acquisition that warrants a second look, though I remain skeptical. Acquisition without comprehension is common in certain types. Henry Vance continues to exceed expectations. He has written 2 compositions this summer that I would not have been embarrassed to show to a city schoolmaster. His thinking is disciplined, his prose is developing genuine clarity, and most importantly, he is beginning to show the characteristic that I consider the surest sign of genuine, heritable intelligence. He evaluates rather than simply accepts. He questioned my summary of a chapter in the natural history book last week. Politely, intelligently, with a specific counter-observation he'd made himself. This is not behavior that can be trained into terminal minds. It emerges from the hereditary stratum. I have decided to write to Mr. Aldrich at the Raleigh County Mission School about the possibility of a placement for Henry in the spring. And for Opal, there is a female academy in Lewisburg that the Mission Board has funded. Opal belongs there. I am aware that removing these children from their community will cause distress, both to them and to their families. But this is precisely the point. The greatest service I can render to the improvable children is to extract them from the hereditary and environmental gravity of their origins before that gravity can complete its work. To leave a child of genuine capacity in a terminal community is to waste her. I will not waste Opal Eustace. The resistance this plan will meet, and I expect considerable resistance, will be the most telling final diagnostic. The families that fight the extraction of their children are, ironically, demonstrating precisely the kind of arrested social instinct that marks the terminal type. The families that acquiesce are demonstrating the ability to transcend immediate emotional interest in favor of long-term rational calculation, which is, of course, a mark of the improvable. Either way, the data will be useful. She wrote, "The data will be useful." She wrote this about the grief she was already anticipating causing, and she kept teaching. The fall term at Yates School was the time when Opal Eustace began to change in ways her mother could not name, but could feel the way you feel, a change in weather. Before the clouds appear, before the temperature drops, and the pressure behind your eyes, and the quality of the light. It wasn't dramatic. Opal was not rude. She was not cold. But she had begun, gradually, nearly imperceptibly, to listen to her family differently. There would be a pause, sometimes, before she answered her mother's questions, a slight stillness around the eyes, as though she was translating. She had stopped using certain words, the dialect words, the old words that had been passed down so long they'd lost the sense of being dialect and had simply become language. She said before instead of afore. She said aren't instead of ain't. Small things. Hester Justice noticed each one the way you notice a piece of a quilt pulling loose at the corner. She mentioned it to Granny Deal one afternoon in October, sitting at Granny Deal's kitchen table while the old woman sorted dried herbs into clay crocks. Granny Deal was 73 or thereabouts. Birth records in the hollow ran intermittently at best, and had lived in this valley her entire life, which meant she'd seen every teacher, every preacher, every mission worker, every timber company agent who'd come through. She had a long memory and a carefully calibrated skepticism. She listened to Hester's accounting of Opal's small changes, her head tilted, her hands continuing their work with the herbs. "What does the teacher say about it?" she asked. "She says Opal is advanced, that she's got a real gift." "She say that to you, or to Opal?" Hester considered. "Both, I think. More to Opal." Granny Deal crushed a handful of dried lemon balm between her palms, released it into a crock. "And what does she say about Silas?" A longer pause. "She says Silas is better suited to practical work. Silas, who does arithmetic in his head faster than any man in the hollow." "That's what I think. What does she say when you think that to her?" "I haven't said it to her." Granny Deal looked up at that. Her eyes were still sharp, gray-brown, slightly yellow at the iris from decades of wood smoke. "Why not?" Hester pressed her lips together. It was a good question. She hadn't said it to Prudence because... Why, exactly? Because Prudence was educated and Hester was not. Because Prudence spoke with the confidence of someone who knew things Hester didn't. Because it felt presumptuous to contradict someone who had read books, who had been to a college, who represented, in some way Hester couldn't quite articulate, a world outside the hollow that Hester both envied and distrusted. "Because she knows more than me," Hester said, "about school." Granny Deal said nothing. She kept sorting herbs. The silence was not disagreement exactly. It was closer to waiting. The way you wait for something you can already see coming to arrive. It was during this period, the autumn of 1891, the beginning of the divide, that Prudence wrote the letter Reverend Edmund Pike treasured for the rest of his life and quoted frequently in his own writings about the Appalachian mission program. "I have seen genuine transformation here, Reverend. Not the surface transformation of mere behavioral compliance, but the deeper alteration of a thinking mind encountering its own capacity for the first time. When Opal Justice reads a passage of natural history and then looks up with a question, not a question of clarification, but a question of expansion, a question that reaches past what I've given her toward what she senses lies beyond it, I am reminded of why this work matters. These children deserve the full breadth of human knowledge. The mission is righteous. I am glad to be here." What the Reverend read in this letter, and what made him tear up slightly when he read it to his wife, was the evidence of a woman fulfilling a godly calling. He kept it in a leather portfolio. What Prudence did not tell the Reverend was that the letter referred only to 5 children. The other 12 she had categorized as unworthy of the full breadth of human knowledge were also in his care. He simply did not know it. There are different kinds of damage. There is the kind that announces itself, the skitter chain that snaps, the mine wall that collapses, the fever that takes a child in a week. You can point to it. You can name the day it happened. And then there is the kind that works in the structure of things, in what people believe about themselves and each other. spreading the way a hairline crack spreads through old stone, invisible until the moment when it is not. The second kind does not make a sound when it happens, and it is very much harder to repair. By the winter of 1892, the crack had begun in earnest. You could see it in the seating arrangements at the school. Not assigned seating. Prudence was far too careful for that. But the natural clustering that children fall into, the social geometry of who sits next to whom, who walks home with whom, which groups form at the woodpile during the midday break. The improvable students had begun to sit together without being told to. Opal, Henry Vance, Mattie Crum, young Ezra Deal before his reclassification, little Luella Ferris. They sat in the front rows. They had more books. They spoke in class more. They were praised more. The feedback loop was closed and self-reinforcing, as feedback loops always are. The others drifted to the back rows. Silas, Thomas, Clem Crum, Butch Ferris. The younger children who had been assessed and found wanting, they completed their exercises. They went home. They spoke to each other more at the woodpile and less in class. A child is not a scientist. A child cannot articulate that they have been categorized and found inferior. But a child feels it. The body keeps a very accurate score. January 14th, 1892. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates. Winter term is proceeding according to plan. Opal Justus is now working from texts I would normally associate with first-year, seminary, preparatory students. Henry Vance has begun a correspondence with a teacher at the Raleigh County School. I arranged it as I felt the intellectual stimulation of a peer at his level would benefit him more than anything I can provide locally. The terminal students are stable. Attendance is acceptable. The winter is mild, so families are not yet keeping older children home for firewood duty. Silas Justice in particular is proving an interesting subject. I observed him this week doing something unexpected. He was calculating load ratios in the margin of his exercise book, using a methodology I recognized as consistent with the bridge engineering texts the timber company uses for rail spur planning. I have since learned from the Ferretti laborer that he provided Silas with engineering reading material. This was an error on Ferretti's part, and I must correct it. Not because the material is inappropriate. The mathematics involved are quite sophisticated, and I was genuinely surprised that Silas could follow them. But because raising the expectations of a terminal type above what his hereditary constitution can sustain long-term is a particular cruelty, he will develop appetites he cannot satisfy. Better to redirect him now, firmly and finally, before the frustration accumulates into something more damaging. Spoke to Silas today. Told him that practical mathematics was a worthy pursuit, but that the engineering materials were beyond the curriculum and should be returned. He handed the books over without argument. He looked at me with an expression I cannot quite characterize. Not anger. Something flatter than anger. I will note it as recognition without effect. I wonder sometimes if I have made an error in his classification. Then I review my data, and I do not wonder. Silas Eustace walked home from the schoolhouse the day Prudence took the engineering books and sat down at the edge of the creek where a big sycamore had fallen across the bank years ago and turned into a bench worn smooth by weather and use. He sat there for a long time. He was 14, going on 15. He was old enough to understand what had happened. Not the word eugenics, not the theory, not the name of Francis Galton, but the fact of it. The fact that someone had looked at him and decided what he was worth, and he had not been consulted, and there was no appeal. He thought about what Giacomo Ferretti had told him, reading those books, that gradient calculations were how engineers planned where the rail would go, that the mathematics in those books was the same mathematics that was currently routing a new logging spur 6 miles up the ridge, that the men who did those calculations were paid accordingly, that the ability to do those calculations was not common and was valued. He sat at the sycamore until the light started to go out of the sky. Then he went home. He did not stop doing mathematics. He began doing it entirely in his head, without paper, without books, without any external sign. He did it the way some people pray, constantly, silently, in the interior of a life that keeps its important things where they can't be taken. Spring 1892 brought the first visible fracture between families. It did not come, as Granny Deal had half expected, from the parents of the unchosen children. It came from the parents of the chosen ones. Cephas Vance, Henry's father, the man who had stood transfixed before the spinning globe, had been quietly, privately proud of his son's progress, in a way that he'd been careful not to let become arrogance, because arrogance about your children made you a figure of ridicule in the hollow, and Cephas was not a man who could afford ridicule. He was a broad-shouldered, capable man with a drinking problem that came and went with the weather, and his own internal weather, and the community's opinion of him was complicated, as it tended to be, for men who were both genuinely useful and intermittently self-destructive. But in the spring of 1892, Henry came home from school with a composition Prudence had him write for submission to the Mission Board's student competition. The competition was for promising students in Appalachian mission schools. The essay prompt was, "What does progress mean?" Cephas read the essay, slowly, working through the words he knew, and guessing at the ones he didn't, at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, while Henry was at the woodpile. He read it twice. Then he set it down. The essay was well written. Prudence had coached Henry through 3 drafts, and the final version was genuinely impressive, organized, clear, with a developing argument structure that was unusual for a 13-year-old. Henry wrote about progress as the improvement of society through the advancement of its most capable members. He wrote about education as a mechanism for identifying those members. He wrote about the responsibility of the capable to leave behind the conditions that had limited them. He had written in the second paragraph the following sentence: "My father, though a good man in the ways that physical labor and simple loyalty permit, represents a type of life that progress must necessarily leave behind, as a river leaves behind the still pools at its edge when it continues toward the sea." Cephas sat with that sentence for a long time. He was not a man of great learning, but he was not a stupid man, and he understood exactly what his son had written. He did not say anything about it to Henry, not that evening, not the next day. He said something to Hester Justice 2 weeks later at the small store at the mouth of the hollow where people bought salt and coffee and nails. He said it quietly and without drama, the way mountain people tended to say important things, sideways, almost casually, so that the importance of it could be denied if it turned out to be unwelcome. "Your girl write essays for the teacher?" he asked. Hester said yes. Opal had written several compositions. "They put you in them? The compositions?" A pause. "I don't read them," Hester said. And then, aware of what she'd just admitted, she added, "She doesn't bring them home." Cephas nodded slowly. He picked up his bag of nails. "Might be worth asking," he said, and left. Hester Justice did ask. She asked Opal that evening, sitting at the table, after supper, in the direct, quiet way that she handled most difficult conversations with her children. Not circling, not softening, just asking the thing. "Do you write about us?" she said. "In your compositions at school?" Opal looked at her mother's face and made a calculation that 12-year-olds should not have to make. Then she said, "Sometimes." "What do you write?" Opal looked at the table. "I write about the hollow, about what it's like here." "What do you say about it?" A long silence. "I say it's beautiful," Opal said. "I say the mountains are beautiful." "And?" Opal did not answer. Hester went to the schoolhouse the following Tuesday, when sessions had finished and the children had gone home. She asked Prudence if she could see Opal's most recent compositions. Prudence, who was a careful woman, hesitated fractionally. Then she said, with perfect smoothness, that she'd be delighted to share them, and produced from her desk drawer a selection of Opal's essays. They were the ones she designated as appropriate for parental review. Hester sat across the desk from Prudence and read them. They were good. They were genuinely impressive. They made her proud in a way that cost her something, because mixed in with the pride was something harder to identify. A sense of increasing distance, like watching a boat move away from shore and feeling proud of its speed while your arms stay empty. She did not see Henry Vance's essay. Prudence had filed that one separately, but she heard about it 3 days later from Cephas Vance himself, who had by then found enough whiskey in him to say the whole thing directly instead of sideways. He came to Hester's door on a Thursday evening, not drunk, but not entirely sober either, the specific state where a man can say true things that he might otherwise manage not to say. He told her what Henry had written. He told her what it said about fathers who represented types of life that progress must leave behind. "My own boy," he said. He was not crying. He was something beyond crying. The specific mountain male affect of a grief so large it's been compressed into something almost entirely motionless. 13 years old. I taught him to tie a fishing knot. I taught him to read trail sign. I sat up 3 nights when he had the fever at 6. My own boy wrote I was an evolutionary remainder. Hester put her hand on his arm and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Later, alone, she tried to find the word for what she was feeling about Prudence Yates and could not find a single word that contained the whole of it. There was something like awe in it. The woman had done this in 9 months, had reached inside a 13-year-old boy and rearranged something fundamental about how he understood his own family. And there was something like terror, because if it had happened to Henry Vance, who else? She went to Granny Deal. Granny Deal heard the whole of it sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of sassafras tea, not interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When Hester finished, the old woman was quiet for a while, which was not her usual mode. She was a woman who generally knew her mind immediately and stated it accordingly. "Giacomo Ferretti knows something," she said finally. Hester blinked. Of all the things she'd expected to hear from Granny Deal, the Italian timber foreman was not among them. "He's been watching the school since last summer," Granny Deal said. "He hasn't said anything direct. He's careful that way, but I've talked to him twice. He asks questions about who's advanced and who's not, about whether there's a pattern to it. He's got a theory. What theory? Granny Deal picked up her tea. He says there's a name for it, what she's doing. He says he's seen it before, back in the old country. Different form. Same idea. People deciding who's worth educating and who's worth only using. He says the ones who decide always think they're being scientific. Hester was quiet for a moment. Is she hurting my children? She's already hurt some of them, Granny Deal said. Whether she can be stopped from hurting more, that I don't know yet. I'm still looking at her. What are you looking for? The old woman set down her cup. Evidence? She said simply. The kind that can't be talked around. The thing about Granny Deal's method was that it required time. She was not a woman who moved before she was ready. She watched Prudence through the spring of 1892 with the quiet, attentive patience she applied to everything that mattered. Studying her, the way she studied the weather signs on the ridge, building a picture from 100 small indicators rather than waiting for the obvious. What she observed was this. Prudence Yates was a systematic woman. She arrived at the schoolhouse at the same time each morning, left at the same time each evening. She was meticulous about her physical possessions. Her desk was always ordered. Her books were always in the same places. She kept her journal in the bottom left drawer of the writing desk, locked with a small brass key that lived on her key ring with the schoolhouse key. Granny Deal did not attempt to access the journal. Not yet. She did not need to. She had other means of understanding. She had the children. Specifically, she had Thomas. Thomas Eustace was 10 years old and had stopped raising his hand in class sometime in the fall of 1891 and had by the spring of 1892 stopped speaking much in general. Not with his family, not with children his age, not with anyone except Granny Deal herself, with whom he had a peculiar rapport that she thought of as the compact between the very old and the very young, who have both been, for their own reasons, pushed to the edges of things. He came to her kitchen after school sometimes. He drew in her presence, the hawk she'd seen him draw that summer, the creek, the ridge lines, the detailed portraits of the hollow's working life that he rendered with a precision that always startled her slightly, because there was nothing approximate about it. He saw what was actually there. "What does Miss Yates say to you at school?" she asked him one afternoon. "She says I'm doing fine," Thomas said. He was drawing a grist mill from memory. The wheel stopped, ice forming along the paddles. "Does she ask you questions, like she asks Opal?" He kept drawing. "She asks me copying questions," he said, "where I copy something off the board and fill in the blank. Not thinking questions. No." Granny Deal watched his hand move across the paper. "Do you want to ask thinking questions?" Thomas looked up from his drawing for the first time since he'd started talking. His eyes were, she thought about this later, very old, not sad exactly, something more settled than sad. "I ask them to myself," he said, "when I'm drawing." "What kind?" "Why things are shaped like they are. The wheel. Why that shape? Why not wider? What changes if the water's lower?" He looked back at his drawing. "Miss Yates says drawing's not useful learning." "She's wrong," Granny Deal said. Thomas didn't respond. he drew the water coming off the wheel in exact droplets. June 8, 1892. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates arrangements. Confirmed with Reverend Pike. Opal Justice will sit entrance examinations for the Greenbrier Female Academy in August. If she passes, and I have no doubt she will begin the fall term there under a Mission Board scholarship. Henry Vance has been provisionally accepted at the Raleigh County Mission School's advanced program. These placements represent the primary achievement of my time here. The community reception of these announcements has been varied. This is not unexpected. The terminal types and their families have reacted with what I can only describe as a compound of envy and self-interest. They see the advancement of the improvable children as a kind of condemnation of their own limitations, which it is, of course, though one need not be crude about it. There have been mutterings. The Ferretti laborer has been asking pointed questions at the community gatherings again. More troublingly, Hester Justice has asked me twice now about Silas, why his materials differ from Opal's, why he has not been recommended for any placement. I have told her that Silas shows promise in practical areas and that his advancement will take a different form. She accepted this, but there is a quality of dissatisfaction in her acceptance that bears monitoring. I do not think Hester Justice is stupid. I think she is limited by circumstances she did not choose and cannot fully see past. This is the tragedy of the terminal type who has nonetheless produced an improvable child, the parent who is almost, but not quite, capable of understanding what has happened. On other matters, I have begun to notice that Thomas Justice spends considerable time with the deal woman. This concerns me less for what it says about Thomas. He is clearly terminal, and her folk herbalism is approximately the level of intellectual engagement appropriate to him, than for what it might mean in terms of that woman's influence over community opinion. She is an elder figure of some weight in this hollow. I have found her eyes on me, at various gatherings, with an expression I cannot entirely categorize. It is not hostile. It is something more careful than hostile. I will continue to monitor. The summer of 1892 was when the hollow began to crack along the lines Prudence had essentially drawn. The announcement of Opal Justice's pending examination for the Greenbrier Academy set off a reaction that Prudence had predicted in its broad strokes, but not in its specific, emotional texture. She had predicted resistance from the community. She had not predicted that the resistance would be split almost exactly down the middle. That some families would react with pride and aspiration, seeing in Opal's advancement the proof that upward movement was possible, while others would react with something closer to grief. Amos Crum, whose daughter Maddie was one of Prudence's improvable students, stood up at the community meeting where the announcements were made and said, with genuine feeling, that it was the finest thing he'd heard in a long time. That his daughter was going to get a proper education. That this was what the mission program was for, and he thanked God and Miss Yates for it. Beside him, his wife Sarah sat with her hands folded, not saying anything. She had been watching Maddie for 8 months, watching the change that Cephas Vance had watched in Henry, the slight formal distance in her speech, the way she sometimes seemed to be translating the dinner table conversation into some other language as she listened to it. She thought about what it meant to send Maddie to a school 4 counties away and bring her home changed in ways she couldn't yet see. She didn't say any of this to Amos. He was proud, and pride in a man who didn't have much to be proud of was a fragile thing. But she talked to Hester Justice, and Hester talked to Granny Deal, and Granny Deal, by September of 1892, had a kitchen table full of quiet, worried women who were all trying to articulate the same unarticulated thing: that their children were being improved in a direction they hadn't chosen, by a process they hadn't consented to, and that the improvement felt like a kind of loss. Is it wrong to want them to have more? Sarah Crum asked at one of these kitchen table gatherings. She meant it genuinely, not rhetorically. Is it wrong to want better for them than what we have? Wanting better for them, and having them decide we're not worth coming home to. Those are two different things, said May Ferris, who had 4 children and had already watched her daughter Luella stop using the family's nickname for her, the one they'd given her at birth and called her by for 10 years. She's not teaching them to despise us, Hester said. Then, in the silence that followed, is she? Granny Deal was quiet for a long time. I don't think she's teaching them to despise us, she said finally. I think she's teaching them that we're below them. I think in her mind, those two things are different. Giacomo Ferretti had reached the same conclusion by a more direct route. He had stopped being subtle about his questions by summer of 1892, because subtle wasn't working. The community was too deferential to Prudence's education and authority to process oblique challenges to either. He needed to be more direct, and being more direct meant accepting the costs of being an Italian timber foreman, criticizing a Presbyterian mission school teacher in a tight-knit Scotch-Irish mountain community in 1892. Those costs were not small. He stood at the edge of a gathering in August of 1892, a church picnic held in the field above the schoolhouse, with the children running between the trees in the last of the summer light, and watched Prudence move through the crowd. Watched how she was with the improvable children versus the rest. The warmth that switched on and off. The invisible thermostat. He found himself standing near Cephas Vance, who was standing alone at the edge of the picnic field with a jar of something that was not lemonade, watching the proceedings with the carefully blank expression of a man who has learned that the wrong expression costs more than blankness. You read your son's essay, Giacomo said. Not a question. Cephas looked at him sideways. Who told you that? You did. Just now. He gestured at Cephas's face. I know what that expression means. Cephas looked back at the field, at Henry, who was sitting next to Opal Justice at one of the picnic tables, the two of them bent over a book, with their heads close together, absorbed and exclusive. He's a good boy, Cephas said. He's always been a good boy. He's going to leave, Giacomo said. I know it. And he won't come back the way he left. A long silence. You trying to make me feel better or worse, Ferretti? Giacomo smiled, very slightly. I am trying to make you angry, he said, because anger is useful and grief is not. Cephas looked at him directly for the first time. Angry at who? At the idea, Giacomo said. Not at the woman. The idea. The idea that there is a line through human beings, that some are worth teaching and some are only worth using. He paused. I have seen this idea before. Different languages, different clothes, always the same result. What result? The line gets wider, Giacomo said. it always gets wider, and the people on the wrong side of it stop believing they belong on the right side, and then they stop trying, and then the people who drew the line say, "You see, we were correct all along." Cephas looked at his jar, at his son, bent over the book. "What do I do about it?" "For now," Giacomo said, "talk to the women. Talk to the deal woman, especially. She has been thinking about this longer than either of us." November 3rd, 1892. From Prudence Yates, Elk Creek Hollow, McDowell County. To Miss Catherine Yates, 14 Broad Street, Charleston, West Virginia. Dear Kath, Ayette, Charleston, West Virginia. Dear Kath, I have so little time to write these days. The fall term is the most intensive, and I am managing the placement paperwork for 2 students simultaneously while keeping the regular curriculum running. You will forgive a short letter. The placements proceed. Opal sat her entrance examinations at the end of August and passed with distinction. The examining board at Greenbrier wrote me personally to say she was among the 3 strongest candidates they had assessed from the mission schools this year. Henry Vance's acceptance at Raleigh County is confirmed. They will both depart in January. There has been, as I expected, community resistance, the mothers especially. I have had 3 conversations with Hester Justice that I would describe as increasingly difficult. She is not unintelligent, and she has been talking to others, and her concerns have become more organized with each meeting. She asked me directly, at our last meeting, whether I treat all students equally. I told her honestly that I teach all students, but that different students have different capacities and that resources must be allocated according to capacity. She accepted this less well than I expected. The Ferretti man has become a persistent irritant. He spoke at the last community gathering in terms that were not accusatory exactly, but pointed. He spoke about selection as if it were a dirty word. I reminded myself that he is a laborer from a country with rather limited educational traditions, and that his framework for understanding pedagogical decisions is consequently limited. I do not hold it against him. I am well otherwise. The mountains are extraordinary in the autumn. The colors are things that painters would not believe if you described them. All my love. Prudence. Opal Hustis left for Greenbrier Academy on the 14th of January, 1893. Hester packed her a trunk, 2 dresses, her underclothes, her Bible, a jar of preserved peaches, a small framed photograph of her father Caleb taken before the accident. She drove Opal to the rail terminus at Welch in the borrowed timber company wagon, with Silas and Thomas in the back, and Della small and silent between them. At the station, Opal cried. She was 12 years old, going to a school 4 counties away to live among strangers, and she cried, and Hester held her for a long time and breathed into her hair. "I'll come back in the summer," Opal said. "Every summer." "You will," Hester said. They both believed it then. They were both wrong. Silas watched the train go. He had not cried. He was 15 by then, and had long since located the compartment in himself where he put things that were too large to be held in the ordinary way. And he put this there. His sister on a train going away. His sister who'd been told she was worth educating. Thomas, beside him, reached out and took his hand. Neither of them said anything. The train was gone around the bend before they let go of each other's hands. January 15th, 1893. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates. Opal Justice departed yesterday for Greenbrier. Henry Vance departs for Raleigh County on Monday. 2 placements achieved. I am aware that the term extraction sounds clinical. I use it in my notes because I need precision, and precision requires accurate language. The improvable children must be extracted from the gravitational pull of their origin community before that community can complete its work of limitation. This is not cruelty. It is medicine. The surgeon extracts the infected tissue. What remains is the healthier for it. Opal's departure has left the classroom dynamic considerably changed. Maddie Crum is now the senior improvable student, and while she is capable, she lacks Opal's quality of restless intellectual reaching. The terminal group is somewhat larger in proportion now, and I find the classroom dynamic heavier, more passive, more resistive. Silas Justice sat in class yesterday and said nothing for the entire session. He completed his exercises quickly. He looked at the empty space on the bench where Opal used to sit. I observed no emotional display. I find it difficult to assess whether this is evidence of limited affective range, consistent with terminal classification, or evidence of remarkable emotional discipline, which would be inconsistent with terminal classification, but would not revise my assessment in any case, since discipline without creative intelligence is simply the higher end of the ordinary. I will miss Opal. She was, genuinely, the finest student I have encountered. I hope Greenbrier knows what it has. January 1893. The Hollow in winter was a different country than its summer self. The ridges, gray-white, with leafless trees. The creek running low and dark under ice at its margins. The sky a slate lid pressed down on the mountains so close you felt you might reach up and touch it. Silas Eustace was 16 now. He had taken work with the timber company in the afternoons and weekends, helping the engineering crew survey the next season's cutting areas. He had made himself useful by demonstrating, quietly, without announcing it, simply by producing accurate results when asked, that he could do the gradient calculations that the surveyors spent considerable time on. He had taught himself from the engineering books that Giacomo had lent him, and that Prudence had taken away, and then taught himself again from the books he'd found at the general store in Welch, and then taught himself a third time from watching the surveyors work and filling in the gaps himself. The head surveyor, a man named Pfeiffer from Morgantown, had noticed after a month that when Silas checked his calculations, he was faster and on 2 occasions more accurate. Pfeiffer had mentioned this to the crew foreman. The crew foreman had mentioned it to the company superintendent. The superintendent had mentioned it, without much interest, that they might want to keep an eye on the Eustace boy. None of this reached Prudence Yates. She had been told by an authority she trusted. Her own assessments, derived from principles she trusted even more, that Silas Justice was terminal, and so the information was literally incoherent to her receiving apparatus. It was like trying to add a new color to a palette that doesn't have a space for it. Giacomo Ferretti heard about the surveying work from Pfeiffer, with whom he had a working relationship built on the shared pragmatism of men who do technical things in difficult terrain. He went to find Silas one Saturday at the surveying camp at the top of the ridge. He found the boy sitting on a stump, eating a cold biscuit and checking Pfeiffer's most recent calculation set against his own work in a small notebook. He sat down on a rock nearby and looked at the calculation set for a moment. "She took the books," he said. "I know more than the books now," Silas said, without defensiveness, without any particular emotion, just as a fact. Giacomo looked at the calculation set, then at the boy's notebook, then back at the calculation set. "You caught an error," he said. "Column 4. He divided instead of multiplied at the radius conversion. It's a small error. It'll read correctly in the field unless the slope exceeds 11%. Does this slope exceed 11%? At the top of the third cutting zone, yes. Giacomo sat with this for a moment. "You should tell him." "I did, last week. He said he'd double check." "Did he?" "No." Giacomo picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "Silas, what does the teacher say about you?" Silas finished his biscuit. He looked out over the valley below the ridge, the hollow, the smoke from the chimneys, the creek catching the thin winter light. "She says I'm practical," he said, "which means not worth more than that." "And what do you say?" A long silence. "I say she made up her mind early," Silas said, "and decided she'd already found out everything she needed to know." Giacomo nodded slowly. "That is a very precise description of what she did. Is there a name for it?" Giacomo thought about the Workers' Congress in Turin, the lecturer with his charts. "Several names," he said. "None of them good." By the spring of 1893, the community of Elk Creek Hollow had divided into two camps so clearly distinct that Sunday church services, which everyone attended, divided only by the Baptist and Methodist denominations that occupied opposite ends of the hollow, had become uncomfortable. The division did not map neatly onto religion. It mapped onto whose children had been chosen and whose had not. The families of the improvable students, the Vances, the Crumbs, the Ferrises, had become, despite their own complicated feelings about what was happening to their children, defenders of the school program. Because the school program had designated their children as worthy. To question the school program was to question the designation, and to question the designation was to accept that their children might be ordinary. And that was a thing that required more courage than most parents possess in the abstract. The families of the unchosen children, and this included the Eustace family in its complexity, had become, without organizing or declaring themselves, a quiet opposition. They didn't have the vocabulary for what they were opposing. They didn't know the word eugenics, but they knew the feeling of it, the feeling of a line drawn through their community by an outside hand, and they didn't like it. The Italian and Welsh workers watched from the margins of this division with a mixture of recognition and helplessness. They were not part of the community in a way that would allow their voices weight in this argument. They were the economic outsiders, the temporary labor, the men who would leave when the timber ran out. Except Giacomo Ferretti, who had no intention of leaving until the thing was finished. They met for the first time as genuine allies rather than cautious acquaintances on a Tuesday afternoon in April in Granny Deal's kitchen, where Giacomo had come ostensibly to ask about a poultice for a timber crew member's infected hand cut. Granny Deal had provided the poultice and then set tea on the table and said, without preamble, "You know what she's doing." "Yes," Giacomo said. "Say it plain." He looked at his tea for a moment. "She has decided which children are worth educating, he said. She has decided this based on a theory that says heredity determines intelligence, and intelligence determines worth, and worth determines what resources a person deserves. She did not ask the children. She did not ask the parents. She built a system that looks like teaching but is actually sorting, and the children on the wrong side of the sort are learning that they are on the wrong side. They are learning it without anyone saying it to them, which is the most efficient way to teach it, because then they teach it to themselves. Granny Deal nodded once, slowly. Can you prove it? Prove what part? The system. That it's deliberate. That she's following a method. I believe she writes it down, Giacomo said. She is a systematic woman. Systematic women write things down. Granny Deal looked at him. Her gray-brown eyes were very steady. And if she writes it down, then we don't need to explain ourselves. We let her explain herself. A silence. The kettle ticked on the stove. Outside, the creek was running high with snowmelt. I don't break into things, Granny Deal said. No, Giacomo agreed. But locks break themselves sometimes when they're not maintained. The old woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her tea. I'll keep watching, she said. August 19th, 1893. Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates. A note arrived from Greenbrier. Opal Eustace has completed her first year with distinction. Highest marks in her form in geography and natural history, which does not surprise me in the least. The principal writes that she has adapted admirably to the Academy's social environment, which I take to mean she has successfully made the transition from her origin community. This is precisely what was required. I have received no direct word from Opal herself. I did not expect any. The improvable students, once extracted, form new social networks, appropriate to their intellectual level, and the old connections naturally attenuate. This is healthy and correct. I have heard, through the Eustace household, where I continue to board, an arrangement that has become increasingly uncomfortable as Hester Eustace has become simultaneously more civil and more hostile, a mountain woman's particular form of quiet war, that Hester wrote to Opal and received a letter in return. I do not know what the letter said. Hester's expression when she folded it and put it in her apron pocket told me nothing certain. On Thomas. He is 11 now. He has become, over this past year, almost entirely silent in class. He completes his work adequately, which is above my expectation for a terminal type, and suggests he may be a moderate rather than severe case, and then sits with that blank, watching expression he has had since I first assessed him. He draws. He is always drawing. I have tried on several occasions to redirect this energy toward more productive pursuits, and he complies briefly, and then reverts. I have ceased spending further attention on it. He has been absent 3 days this week. When I asked Hester, she said he had a cold. He does not look ill at community events. I believe he is avoiding school. This is the expected outcome for terminal types who internalize their assessment. Withdrawal, avoidance, eventual dropout. It is not pleasant to observe, but it is consistent with the data. Natural attrition, expected outcome. And she wrote that phrase. Natural attrition, expected outcome. About a child who was 11 years old and who had stopped going to school. Because going to school had become a place where he learned every day in 100 small ways that he was not worth teaching. She was not aware that she had caused this. In her framing, the child's withdrawal was evidence of his limitation. His limitation was why he was being given nothing that might counter the withdrawal. The circle was closed and self-confirming, and entirely invisible to the person standing inside it. Granny Deal saw Thomas at the creek that week, on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting on the sycamore log with his piece of slate and his nail. He was drawing the school building, or rather, he was drawing what the school building looked like from the outside, from across the field, when the windows were lit from within, and the smoke was coming from the chimney, and the inside was warm and occupied, and he was out here in the gray light looking at it. She sat down beside him. She did not say anything for a long time. "Thomas," she said finally, "do you know what you want to be?" He thought about it honestly, which was the thing she appreciated about him. He did not give the answer he thought she wanted. He gave the answer he had. "An engineer," he said, "like the men who plan the rail." "Why?" "Because you figure things out," he said. "From the math. You figure out what's there before you can see it." Granny Deal looked at the drawing in his hand, the schoolhouse with its warm windows. "That's a beautiful drawing," she said. "Miss Yates says it's not useful learning," he said. "Miss Yates," Granny Deal said carefully, "is wrong about some things." Thomas looked up at her. He had his father Caleb's eyes, the same dark, direct quality that had made Caleb Eustace a man people trusted on instinct. "Is she wrong about me?" Granny Deal met his gaze. "Yes," she said, "she is very wrong about you." He looked back at his drawing. She could not tell if he believed her. She was not sure. Belief was what she needed to give him. What she needed to give him was proof. She was still looking for the key to the proof. In September of 1893, the McDowell Lumber and Land Company pushed its cutting operation past the second ridge and into the upper reaches of the tributary hollows north of Elk Creek. This brought the timber crews, sawyers and swampers and teamsters and skidder operators, into areas where small farmsteads had sat undisturbed for 50 years, perched in the narrow hollows above the creek forks where the soil was thin but adequate for a garden, and the creek ran cold and clear, and fish still ran in good numbers. The company bought the timber rights to most of these farmsteads. The farmers had sold them years earlier, not fully understanding what they were selling, which is to say, they'd understood they were selling the trees, but not that the trees were the thing holding the hillside in place. Not that the road cuts and skidder operations would silt the creek and destroy the garden soil and turn the clear water into a brown-orange flow of suspended clay. The company was within its rights. The company was always within its rights. This expansion brought Giacomo Ferretti's crew to within a mile of the Elk Creek schoolhouse. It also brought the hazards of large-scale timber harvesting within a mile of the Elk Creek schoolhouse, the high-speed log runs, the cable skidder operations, the temporary rail spurs, with their freight cars of green timber rolling at speed down grades that pushed the mechanical limits of the equipment. It was in this context, in October of 1893, that Thomas Eustace stopped attending school entirely. He began instead spending his days at the edge of the cutting operations, watching. He watched the surveyors, the engineers who planned the skidder cable runs, the men who calculated loads and grades. He had a notebook now. Granny Deal had given him one, a proper composition book. And he filled it with sketches and calculations. Not guesses. Calculations, worked through from first principles, checked against what he observed the surveyors doing. He was teaching himself the way his brother Silas had taught himself. From observation, from inference, from the particular stubbornness of a mind that has been told it cannot and finds this disagreement motivating rather than conclusive. He was 11 years old. Hester Eustace did not know immediately that Thomas had stopped attending school. He left at the right time each morning and returned at the right time each afternoon, and she had enough to manage. The house, Della, who was now 8 and needed considerable supervision, the garden's final harvest before frost, that she did not, for the first week, track exactly what he was doing in the hours between departure and return. It was Granny Deal who told her. The old woman had seen Thomas at the cutting site 3 mornings running, and had said nothing immediately because she was watching what he did there, what he was teaching himself, how the men at the site treated him. The men mostly ignored him. A boy at the edge of a work site is invisible in a certain way. He is assumed to be there because a father or uncle is working. He is assumed to be waiting. No one checked. Except Giacomo Ferretti, who noticed the notebook. "What are you calculating?" he asked Thomas, crouching beside him on a Saturday when the work was lighter and Giacomo had time. Thomas showed him. He'd been working through the load distribution calculations for the main skidder cable, the same calculations that had occupied the engineering crew for 2 weeks. His method was different from theirs, coming at the problem from a different geometric angle, but his result was within 3% of the engineer's conclusion. Giacomo looked at the notebook for a long time. Then he looked at the boy. "How old are you?" 11. "Where did you learn this?" "From watching," Thomas said, "and from Silas, and from thinking about it." Giacomo sat back on his heels. He thought about the journal in the bottom drawer of Prudence Yates's desk, the word terminal written next to this child's name. "Thomas," he said, "I want you to go back to school." Thomas looked at him with that flat, settled expression that was by now the boy's characteristic resting face. Why? Because there are things she knows how to teach that you need, and because leaving school gives her evidence that she's right about you. She thinks she's already right about me. "Yes," Giacomo said, "but you don't have to agree." Thomas went back to school the following Monday. He sat in the back row. He completed his exercises. He did not raise his hand. What happened next was not caused by his return to school. It would have happened regardless of where Thomas Eustace was on the morning of November 3rd, 1893. What happened was this. A log run on the Upper Creek skidder operation broke. The cable, holding the rear of a loaded timber sled, snapped. It had been weakened by a nick from a saw blade 6 weeks prior. The kind of damage that should have been caught in inspection, but was not because the inspection had been cursory and the foreman had been running behind schedule. The sled, loaded with 4 massive white oak logs, ran free down the 17% grade of the skidder road. It covered the 300 yards to the creek crossing in approximately 8 seconds. At the creek crossing, where the road crossed on a temporary timber bridge, there were 4 men. 3 of them, hearing the sled's runaway noise, a sound every timber worker knew and reacted to reflexively, jumped clear in time. The fourth was a Welsh sawyer named Di Morgan, who was 60 yards downstream and did not hear it coming until it was too late. Thomas Eustace was not at the creek crossing. He was 200 yards up the hollow, watching the skidder operation from his usual position at the edge of the clearing. He heard the sled break loose. He heard the men shout. He heard the impact. He ran. He was the first person to reach Di Morgan, who was alive but badly injured. His right leg crushed below the knee, his head cut from the impact of the bridge railing. Thomas knelt beside him in the creek mud and held his head out of the water and shouted for help until the men arrived, which took 4 minutes. Di Morgan lost the leg below the knee. He was alive. The investigation of the accident, conducted by the company superintendent and Giacomo Ferretti jointly, concluded that the cable failure was the result of inadequate inspection. Giacomo wrote in his incident report that a more thorough pre-operational inspection protocol might have identified the cable damage. He also noted, in a section that did not make it into the formal report, that Thomas Justice's quick response had very likely saved Di Morgan's life. The superintendent acknowledged this verbally. Nothing was put in writing. November 3rd, 1893, Private Journal of Miss Prudence Yates. The timber accident at the Upper Creek skidder has created considerable disruption in the community. The Welshman's injury is serious, and the community's reaction is the usual combination of communal support, which is genuinely admirable in these people, and suspicion of the company, which is reflexive and frequently, though not always, warranted. Thomas Eustace was apparently present and of some assistance. I have heard this secondhand and have not been able to verify exactly what he did. The characterizations have ranged from "he held the man's head" to "he saved his life." The latter being the kind of community mythologizing that I've observed here before, where a small act becomes in retelling something heroic. This is not a criticism of the community, but an observation of a universal human tendency. I returned to my assessment of Thomas this evening. He is 11, and I stand by my classification. The presence at the accident site of a child who is supposed to be in school suggests not heroic instinct, but a lack of structure. A boy who wanders because his home and school environments fail to contain him. This is a symptom, not a distinction. In other matters, the mail brought a note from Reverend Pike today requesting my annual report in December. I have begun drafting it. The report will summarize 2 placements, Opal Eustace, Henry Vance, and describe ongoing educational progress for the remaining students. I will include a section on community engagement. I will not include a description of my classification system in the official report. This is not deception. It is professional discretion. The board does not need the methodology. They need the results. She wrote that about Thomas Eustace on the same day. Thomas Eustace held a man's head out of floodwater for 4 minutes in cold November mud. She wrote it from her bedroom at Hester Eustace's house, using Hester's table beside Hester's lamp. And in 3 days, everything would change. The fracture lines that had been spreading through Elk Creek Hollow since the spring of 1892 broke open fully in November of 1893, and, as Prudence had half predicted, though not in the form she'd imagined, the break did not come over her directly. It came over the values she'd introduced. The catalyst was a letter. Henry Vance, away at the Raleigh County Mission School for his second term, had written home. The letter was addressed to his father, which was unusual. Henry had stopped writing to Cephas directly after the first few months away, his letters going instead to the school or to Reverend Pike as formal progress reports. But this letter came addressed to Cephas Vance, Elk Creek, McDowell County. Cephas could read only simple words. He had his neighbor, Luther Ferris, read it to him. The letter said, in Henry's developing formal prose, that he had been studying the social sciences at the Raleigh County School, and that he had been assigned an essay on the subject of heredity and social station, and that he had found the subject clarifying in ways he was grateful to Miss Yates for introducing him to. He wrote that he had come to understand his origin community in a new light, as an example of what happened when a population in hereditary stasis was exposed to the pressures of industrial change without the necessary intellectual preparation. He wrote that he felt a certain distance from his childhood that he suspected was the natural consequence of upward movement in a stratified system, and that while he did not mean this as any reflection on his father personally, he could no longer pretend to himself that he and his father shared the same social world. He used the phrase, "my father's type." Luther Ferris stopped reading. He looked at Cephas. Cephas was sitting very still. His hands were on the table, and his face had the carved quality that mountain faces get when feeling goes past its words. "Keep going," he said. Luther kept going. The letter was 2 pages. By the end, Henry had inquired after the family, expressed hope that everyone was well, and signed off with, "Your son, Henry Vance," not "your loving son," not "your devoted son," just "your son." The way you'd sign a letter to an acquaintance you were careful to be polite to. Luther put the letter down. "Seph," he said. "I'm sorry." Cephas picked up the letter. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down again, very carefully, and walked out of the house without his coat, into the November cold. He walked to Granny Deal's house. She opened the door before he knocked. She had been expecting someone, not Cephas specifically, but someone. The breaking point had been approaching for months, and she'd felt it in the quality of the Hollow's conversations, the tight silences where loose talk used to flow. She made him sit down. She put hot coffee in front of him. She listened to the whole letter, which he recited from memory, because a man remembers the things that wound him with perfect precision. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "She did this," he said. "She didn't write the letter," Granny Deal said carefully. "She made him into the kind of person who writes it. That's the same thing." Granny Deal looked at her coffee. Outside, the wind was moving in the ridge trees. A dry, cold sound, leaves long gone, just the bare branches. "Seph, have you talked to Hester Justus?" "No. You should." "Because of Silas?" "Partly." She looked up at him. "And because what she wrote me last week." "What did she write you?" Granny Deal went to the shelf beside the stove and brought back a folded piece of paper. She put it on the table between them. It was a letter from Opal Justus at Greenbrier Academy to her mother, Hester. Hester had not shown it to Granny Deal. She had given it to her. The difference mattered. Cephas read it. He could read, slowly, and he read this one with the same painful attention he'd given to Henry's letter. Opal's letter was kind. She was a kind girl. Still, underneath everything. But it was the kindness of distance. She wrote about her classes, her teachers, her friends at the academy. She wrote that she was well and happy. She wrote that she would try to come home the following summer if the term schedule permitted. The if was new. There had been no if before. She wrote one paragraph about home. About the mountains, which she said she missed. She did not mention Silas. She did not mention Thomas. She mentioned Della, briefly, in a sentence about wishing everyone was well. She did not sound like Opal Justus of Elk Creek Hollow. She sounded like a girl who used to live there. Cephas put the letter down. He looked at Granny Deal. "We let this happen," he said. "Yes," the old woman said, "because she spoke with authority, and we didn't have the language to argue back. That doesn't make us fools. It makes us people who trusted the wrong person." "What do we do now?" Granny Deal stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the hollow, the bare trees, the gray sky, the creek running dark below the ice line. She had lived here 73 years. She had watched every kind of outside influence come into this hollow and leave its mark. She had watched the first timber company come in 1879 and take what it came to take. She had watched the mission preachers. She had watched the labor recruiters. She had thought, watching each of them, that she understood the mechanism, that she could see clearly enough to protect what mattered. She had not seen Prudence Yates coming. That was the truth of it. She had not seen an educator as a predator. She should have. "She writes everything down," Granny Deal said. "The Ferretti man told me. Her system, how she decides which children are worth teaching and which aren't. It's all in a book." "How do you get the book?" The old woman turned from the window. "Carefully," she said, "and at the right moment. What happened next required 3 things to align: an opportunity, a decision, and a willingness to accept that what she was about to do would make her, technically, a thief in the eyes of the law if anyone chose to apply it. Granny Deal had thought about this carefully. She had considered the proportions of it. The small wrongness of taking something that didn't belong to her against the specific, ongoing, documented harm being done to the children of this hollow. She had thought about Hester Eustace's face when she gave her, Opal's, letter. She had thought about Thomas at the creek that day with the man's head in his hands. She had thought about Silas doing engineering calculations in secret on his lunch break, hiding his mind like a contraband item. She had made her peace with the proportions. The opportunity came in the 3rd week of November. Prudence Yates went to Welch, a 2-day trip for supplies and a meeting with Reverend Pike to review the annual report. She had been planning this trip for 2 weeks, and Granny Deal had known about it for 10 days because information traveled through a community of women the way water travels through karst limestone, underground, invisible, in ways that would surprise you if you didn't know to look for the springs. Hester Justice had the spare key to the schoolhouse. She'd been given it 2 years ago when she'd agreed to keep the woodpile stocked through the winter. She had used it exactly twice. She gave it to Granny Deal without asking what it was for, in the way you give a trusted person a tool and trust them to use it correctly. Granny Deal went to the schoolhouse alone in the early morning of November 24th, 1893, with the spare key and a small knife for the desk lock, which she did not need. the lock on Prudence's bottom desk drawer, was a simple brass affair that had been installed primarily as a signal of privacy, rather than a serious security measure, and it gave way to a thin piece of wire in under a minute. She took the journal. She did not take anything else. She locked the drawer again. She locked the schoolhouse and returned the key. She went home and sat at her kitchen table and began to read. She read for 6 hours. She read through the morning, through the midday, into the early afternoon. She made tea and let it go cold. She got up once to put wood on the fire. She sat back down and kept reading. The journal began in March of 1891 with entries about the school's physical condition, the students' initial assessments, the challenges of adapting city teaching methods to mountain students. These early entries had a quality she recognized, the quality of a person genuinely trying to do something good, genuinely caring about the work. Prudence Yates had not arrived in Elk Creek Hollow as a villain. This was the part that mattered most to Granny Deal, the part she kept returning to as she read. The woman had arrived believing she was helping. The entries from April and May of 1891, when the classification system appeared, were harder to read. The clinical vocabulary, the column headings, improvable, terminal, applied to children she had watched grow up, children she had helped birth, children whose parents she had sat with in grief and in celebration. Seeing those children's names in those columns was the coldest thing she had read in a long life that had included cold things. She read about Thomas. Terminal, expected outcome, withdrawal, avoidance, eventual dropout. She read about Silas. Terminal, mechanically quick with computation, rote memory strong, but when pressed beyond the rote, shows limited creative application. She read about Opal's extraction. She read about how the resistance of the non-chosen families proved their terminal status. She read the entry about Henry Vance's essay. How Prudence had celebrated a 13-year-old calling his own father an evolutionary remainder as evidence of successful development. She read the entry from November 3rd about Thomas Justus at the accident site. The characterizations have ranged from "he held the man's head" to "he saved his life," the latter being the kind of community mythologizing that I've observed here before. She put the journal down. She looked at the fire. She thought about Thomas, who was 11 years old, who had done a genuinely brave and difficult thing, and had been described by the woman who was supposed to be his teacher as a child who wandered because his environment failed to contain him. She thought about the word terminal. She picked the journal back up and kept reading. When Prudence Yates returned from Welch on the evening of November 25th, the community was waiting. Not in anger. That was the thing she would not have predicted. She had imagined, if she had imagined a confrontation at all, that it would take the form she associated with this community's confrontations. Blunt, loud, possibly physical. She had imagined Cephas Vance, with whiskey in him, in her schoolhouse doorway. She had imagined male anger, the kind that was easy to dismiss. What was waiting for her instead was a gathering of 37 people, men, women, the older children, in the schoolhouse, sitting on the benches in the lamplight, in the November dark. The schoolhouse was warm. Someone had built the fire up. On Prudence's desk, in plain view, was the journal. Granny Deal was sitting in Prudence's chair. There are moments in history that happen without witnesses, or with witnesses who cannot report, and we lose them. And there are moments that get written down or told in families for generations until the oral account is almost all that remains. What happened in the Yates School on the night of November 25th, 1893, is one of the second kind. The account that survives comes from 4 sources. Granny Deal's own telling, which she gave to her granddaughter Rachel in 1921, and which Rachel wrote down. A letter Giacomo Ferretti sent to his brother in Baltimore, dated December 2nd, 1893, a brief mention in Reverend Pike's personal diary, and a single sentence in Hester Eustace's Bible on the family history page, in the blank space after Caleb's death date, where she wrote, November 25th, 1893, the school night. These accounts do not entirely agree on details. They agree entirely on what mattered. Prudence Yates came into the schoolhouse and stopped. She had come from Hester's house. That was where she boarded, and she'd put down her bag and come directly to the schoolhouse when she saw the light in the windows, because she'd left no instructions for the school to be used in her absence, and she wanted to see who had used it and why. She came in through the front door and stopped. 37 people looked at her from the benches. The lamplight was warm and the wood stove was going well, and it should have been a cozy scene, a community gathered in their schoolhouse on a cold night. Except for the quality of the silence, which was the specific silence of people who have been waiting for something and are now watching it arrive. Granny Deal was sitting in Prudence's chair, behind Prudence's desk. The journal was on the desk. In the lamplight, Prudence could see the pages. "Come in, Miss Yates," Granny Deal said. Her voice was the same voice she always used, measured, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had decided she was not afraid of this conversation. "And close the door. It's cold." Prudence came in. She closed the door. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 37 people on the benches and at the journal on her desk, and understood in that moment that the world had changed in a way she had not planned for. She looked at the journal. She looked at Granny Deal. "That belongs to me," she said. "I know it does," Granny Deal said. "I borrowed it." "That's not your right." "No," the old woman agreed. "It's not." She did not look away. "I've done things in my life that weren't my right. I carried a man's baby that wasn't my husband's once, so his wife wouldn't have to. I've set bones that were supposed to wait for a doctor. I've made medicines that the law in some counties calls illegal. I'm an old woman, Miss Yates. My judgment on what's my right has a particular shape, and it doesn't always match what's written down." She opened the journal. "I'm going to read some of this," she said, "and then we're going to talk." Prudence made a movement, a step toward the desk, and stopped. Cephas Vance was on the front bench, directly between her and the desk, and he was not threatening. His hands were in his lap. He was not looking at her with violence. He was looking at her with something that was worse than violence. He was looking at her with the face of a man who has accepted something and is waiting to hear the words that confirm it. She stopped. Granny Deal read. She read deliberately, in her carrying voice, the voice she'd learned as a girl in church when people sat in the back of the room and needed to hear. She read the column headings: improvable, terminal. She read the names under each heading. She read slowly enough that every person in the room could follow, could find the names of their own children, could understand what the columns meant. She read the passage about Silas. Terminal, when pressed beyond the rote, shows limited creative application. Beside Hester Eustace, who was in the third row, Silas was very still. He was 16 years old, and he was listening to himself described. His face did not change. He was holding very still, the way a person holds still when they're choosing not to break. Granny Deal read the passage about Thomas. Terminal, expected outcome. Withdrawal, avoidance, eventual dropout. Thomas was not in the schoolhouse. He was at home with Della, too young for this. Hester had arranged that, but she knew she would have to tell him what had been said about him. She was already thinking about how to say it. Granny Deal read the passage about Henry Vance's essay. He evaluated, rather than simply accepted. This is not behavior that can be trained into terminal minds. She read the surrounding context, how Prudence had celebrated Henry calling his father an evolutionary remainder as evidence of genuine, heritable intelligence. Cephas Vance, on the front bench, made a sound in his chest. A single, compressed sound, like a fist clenching. Granny Deal read the passage about Opal's extraction. To leave a child of genuine capacity in a terminal community is to waste her. Hester Justice's eyes filled with tears and did not spill. She was 41 years old, and she had been a widow for 3 years, and she had survived harder things than this by the specific mountain method of not allowing your interior state to control your exterior face. She sat very still and kept listening. Granny Deal read the passage about resistance to the placements. The families that fight the extraction of their children are demonstrating precisely the kind of arrested social instinct that marks the terminal type. The room was very quiet. She read the final passage she had chosen, the entry from November 3rd about Thomas and the accident, about community mythologizing, about a boy who wandered because his environment failed to contain him. She closed the journal. She looked at Prudence Yates. Prudence had, in the 20 minutes of the reading, gone through several things. The first was a hot, clean anger at the violation of her privacy, at the misrepresentation of her work, at the presumption of this old woman sitting in her chair reading her private writings to a crowd. The second was a cooler thing beneath the anger, the recognition that what was being read was accurate. The words were hers. The system was hers. She had written it, and she had meant it, and she still believed it. The third thing was the hardest to name. It was not guilt. She did not feel guilt, in the ordinary sense. She had not set out to hurt these children. She had set out to help the ones she determined were helpable, and the rest was a natural consequence of resource allocation. But there was something. Watching Silas Eustace on his bench, watching his face as she heard himself described. Something that touched a register she did not normally use. She was a systematic woman. She maintained her composure. "You've misrepresented my work," she said when Granny Deal finished. "What you've read is clinical notation, a pedagogical framework. You've read it to an audience without the educational background to understand the scientific context." "Say the simple version," Granny Deal said. "The simple version is that I have limited time and resources, and I allocated them rationally to some children, to the children with the most potential for advancement. And you decided who had potential. Yes. Based on what you looked at them and thought." A pause. based on established scientific principles of hereditary capacity and observed cognitive. Miss Yates. Granny Deal's voice was still measured. It had not risen. I delivered most of these children. I set their legs when they broke them. I nursed their fevers. I know these children in a way you can't from the front of a classroom. And I am telling you, with 73 years behind me, that you are wrong about Silas Justice. You are wrong about Thomas Justice. You were wrong to take Opal away in the way you took her away. And you were wrong to teach Henry Vance to look at his father and see a lesser creature. Henry will have opportunities. Henry is a boy who called his father an evolutionary remainder, Granny Deal said, in writing at 13 years old. You were proud of that. Silence. His opportunities, she said, are not worth his father. Another silence. Cephas Vance, on the front bench, made no sound. He was looking at the middle distance. Giacomo Ferretti spoke from the back of the room, for the first time since the reading had begun. In Italy, he said, there is a word, cernita. It means sorting. When they built the canals, the labor contractors would look at the men who came to work and divide them into groups. The ones they thought were strong enough for the hard work, and the ones they thought were not. The ones who were sorted out were paid less, worked harder, and were told their sorting was fair. They were told science supported the sorting. He paused. It was not science. It was the preference of the men who did the sorting, given a scientific name. He looked at Prudence directly. You gave your preference a scientific name. Prudence was a precise, intelligent woman. She had a response to this argument. She knew it intellectually. She had read the counter-arguments to Galton and found them insufficient. She was prepared to defend her position. She opened her mouth. And then she looked at the room. 37 people. The Justices, the Vances, the Crumbs, the Ferrises. Granny Deal's granddaughter Rachel, who was 20 and had 3 children and had never been inside the school at all. Owen Davies, the Welsh foreman, who had come because Giacomo had told him to come. 3 of the Italian timber workers who spoke very little English but had come because Giacomo had asked. The old men who remembered when there was no school in this hollow at all. 37 people who had trusted her with their children. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She did not apologize. This is important to say clearly. She did not apologize. She was not moved to apology, because to apologize would be to admit she was wrong. And she did not believe she was wrong. She believed she had done the scientifically correct thing. She believed, even in this room, even looking at Silas Eustace's still face, and Hester's held-in eyes, and Cephas Vance's carved grief, that her framework was sound, and her method was correct, and the outcomes, however painful in the short term, were serving a rational good. But she was also a woman who could read a room. I see, she said finally, that the community has reached a conclusion about my methods. We've reached a conclusion about you, Granny Deal said. Prudence looked at her, at the journal on the desk, at the room of 37 people. I'll need the journal returned, she said. No, Granny Deal said simply. I think we'll keep it. Prudence Yates left Elk Creek Hollow on December 3rd, 1893. She gave 3 weeks' notice. She was a professional woman, and she would not simply walk out. And then she packed her trunk and took the supply wagon to Welch and took the train to Charleston. She was not arrested. She was not charged with anything. What she had done was not a crime. Not then, not in West Virginia, not by any statute that existed. She had taught school. She had categorized students. She had made placement recommendations. All of this was within the normal range of what school teachers did and were expected to do. The mission board received a letter from Granny Deal, a letter that Giacomo Ferretti had helped her write because her literacy was functional but not formal, describing what had occurred. Reverend Pike, to his lasting credit, was horrified. He had not known. He truly had not known. He wrote 3 letters to Prudence, one asking for her account, one expressing his concerns about the journal entries that had been shared with him, and one, the final one, which was essentially an acknowledgement that the program he had sponsored had caused harm it had not intended, and that he was not certain how to address that. He did not address it. He moved on to other missions. He quoted his letter from Prudence about opal justice, the one about a mind encountering its own capacity, for the rest of his life. He omitted context. Prudence Yates returned to Charleston and eventually took a position at a private girls' school there, where she taught for 11 years and was regarded as excellent. She never returned to McDowell County. She never wrote about her time there in any public format. Her private journal, the one that had been taken from her desk, stayed with Granny Deal until the old woman died in 1907, at which point it went to Rachel, who kept it in a cedar chest under her bed for the rest of her life. It is not known what ultimately happened to the journal. It had become, by then, a thing too painful to look at and too important to destroy. The family kept it the way families keep some things. Not displayed, not discussed, but present. A weight in the house that shaped the air around it. What Granny Deal had told Hester, what she's already hurt, proved true in the aftermath of Prudence's departure, in ways that had nothing to do with Prudence herself, because the damage she'd done was structural. It lived in the community now, not in her. The line she had drawn between the chosen and the unchosen, between the worthy and the terminal, had been made visible in the schoolhouse on November 25th, but visibility did not erase it. If anything, it sharpened it. Because now, everyone knew which side of the line their children had been on, and the knowing changed the way people looked at each other across that line. The families of the chosen students, even those who had been horrified by the journal reading, even Cephas Vance, who had every reason in the world to be angry at what had been done to Henry, could not entirely unfeel the pride they'd felt at their children's designation. Pride is not a moral failing, but it is sticky. It stays in the material of how you think about yourself and your family, even after the foundation of it has been shown to be rotten. And the families of the unchosen could not entirely unfeel what had been confirmed on that November night, that the woman who had been entrusted with their children's education had looked at their children and decided they were worth less. That this decision had been made in private, systematically, in the language of science, that they had participated in it, unknowingly, by sending their children to school and trusting the teacher and feeling the gratitude of parents who are told the education system is working. They felt the shame of it. That was Granny Deal's prediction, and she was right. The reaction to the schoolhouse reading was not rage. It was shame. The particular shame of people who have been manipulated and are trying to determine how much of the manipulation they consented to. Silas Justus turned 17 in the spring of 1894. He had been doing surveying calculations for the timber company for 6 months by then, and in January, with a letter of recommendation from Giacomo Ferretti and the active encouragement of the head surveyor, Pfeiffer, he was offered a position as a junior surveying assistant with the company's engineering division. It paid 3 times what a day laborer made. He took the position. He worked for the McDowell Lumber and Land Company for 2 years, learning everything he could from the engineering crew. And then he took a night course in engineering mathematics at the Technical Institute in Welch, and then he moved to Charleston. And then, in 1902, he joined an engineering firm in Pittsburgh that was building infrastructure for the steel industry. He did not return to Elk Creek Hollow often. The work was always somewhere else. But he wrote to his mother every 2 weeks, without fail, for the rest of her life. The letters were practical, factual, newsy. He was not a man who expressed himself in emotional registers on paper, but they came every 2 weeks, rain or shine, wherever the work took him. He never mentioned Prudence Yates, not in any letter his family kept, not in any account anyone who knew him recorded. If he thought about her, and it would have been extraordinary if he did not, he kept it where he kept everything that was too large to hold in the ordinary way, in the interior compartment, pressed flat, functional. Thomas Justus was 11 years old when Prudence Yates left McDowell County and the school she had run, which was briefly taken over by a temporary teacher from the mission board, a young man named Garrett, who lasted 6 months and then left, essentially collapsed as an institution in her wake. The temporary teacher taught all 17 remaining students as a single group, which was the original model before Prudence had arrived, and the educational quality returned to its pre-1891 level. Adequate, well-intentioned, fundamentally limited. Thomas continued his notebook. He continued teaching himself. From engineering texts, he borrowed from Giacomo Ferretti, and from observation of the timber company's operations. He was, by the time he was 13, doing calculations that the junior engineers on the company's survey crew found impressive enough to mention upward. He was also, and this is the hardest part, and the part that no one who loved him knew how to address, profoundly damaged in his understanding of what he was worth. A child who is told, through the systematic behavior of the adult who is supposed to be educating them, that they are terminal, that their ceiling has been measured and found low, does not receive this information as a simple external statement. They receive it as an interior truth. It gets into the structure of how they think about themselves. It becomes the voice that speaks when they approach something new and difficult, and asks, "But why try? You already know what you are." Thomas's gift was real. The calculations in his notebooks were real. The thing Granny Deal had seen in him, the thing Giacomo Ferretti had seen, the thing that had made him useful at the accident site at 11 years old, all of it was real. And it sat alongside, in the same person, an equally real certainty that he was terminal, that his ceiling was low, that the evidence was the entire 2 years of his schooling. He became, in his teenage years, intermittently self-destructive, not dramatically, not in the way of the stories people tell. Intermittently, the specific kind of self-destruction that looks, from the outside, like bad luck or poor judgment, and that comes from a person who does not quite believe they are worth preserving. He worked in the timber camps. He worked in the coal mines when the timber work ran out. He was good at it. Better than good. The foreman always noted his quickness, his spatial reasoning, his ability to see problems before they fully announced themselves. And he kept working at jobs that underused him, because he had learned at an age when the learning is permanent that he was not the kind of person who got to do the work that required everything he had. He died in February of 1901. He was 19 years old. A timber camp accident on the Tug Fork, a log run, a cable failure, not entirely unlike the one he'd survived when he was 11. Except this time, he was in the wrong position, and there was no one close enough to reach him. The investigation found no negligence. The cable had worn in a way that regular inspection would not have caught. It was, in the language of the reports, an accident. It was also a 19-year-old boy who worked in dangerous conditions because he did not believe he deserved safer ones. That is not in any report. That is the kind of thing that lives in the gap between what is recorded and what is true. Hester Justice wrote Thomas's death date in the Bible beside Caleb's. She did not write anything else. There was nothing else to write that the page could hold. Giacomo Ferretti stayed in McDowell County for another 3 years after Prudence left. He oversaw the completion of the timber operation on the Upper Creek drainage, watched the hillsides go bare and the creek go silted, and then, when the timber company moved its operation south, packed his own trunk and went back to Baltimore. He had stayed, he told his brother Marco in a letter, because he'd needed to see the thing through. To be certain it was finished. That the woman who had named herself a sorter of human beings was actually gone. He ran a small importing business in Baltimore for the rest of his life, importing stone from the Carrara quarries for building facades and memorial work. He married a woman from the Italian neighborhood, had 3 children, and lived to 71. He was a regular reader of the newspapers and maintained, his children said, a particular alertness to certain kinds of language, the language of classification, of selection, of scientific authority applied to human worth. He would read such articles aloud at the dinner table with a careful, contained anger, and then explain, in specific terms, what the language meant and what it was for. His children could not always follow the explanation, but they remembered the anger, and they remembered the story of McDowell County, which he told them in its entirety once, when the oldest was 15, because he believed children should know what ideas could do. November 8th, 1893. From Prudence Yates, Elk Creek Hollow, McDowell County, to Miss Catherine Yates, 14 Broad Street, Charleston, West Virginia. Dear Kath, I have time for only a short note as I am preparing for the annual report and managing some community difficulties that I expect will resolve. I wanted to tell you that the experiment has proceeded beyond my expectations. 2 students successfully placed at advanced institutions. The sorting has been validated. The improvable students have advanced. The terminal students have behaved as terminal students behave. I have been thinking, lately, about what these 32 months constitute as a body of evidence. I believe they constitute a significant proof of concept. I have demonstrated, in a controlled environment, that resource allocation according to heritable potential produces measurable outcome differentiation. That is, I believe, scientifically significant. I don't expect the community to understand this. They see children and families. They cannot take the view from above. I'll write more soon. P. They see children and families. They cannot take the view from above. She wrote this about the people who knew these children from birth, who had sat up with them in fever, who had buried their fathers. She wrote it because she believed it. And here is the most important thing to understand about Prudence Yates. The thing that makes her not a monster of fiction, but a product of her real historical moment. She was not unusual. She was not an outlier. What she believed was what the educated classes of 1890s America largely believed, that human beings could be scientifically sorted into the worth developing and the worth using, that this sorting was benevolent because it was efficient, that the people doing the sorting were doing civilization a service. These ideas did not remain abstract for long. In 1907, Indiana became the first state to pass a compulsory sterilization law targeting people deemed unfit. By 1927, the United States Supreme Court, in Buck v. Bell, upheld Virginia's compulsory sterilization law with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most celebrated legal minds in American history. Writing the majority opinion, he wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded had been operating since 1910, and its patient population was drawn disproportionately from exactly the kind of Appalachian community that Prudence Yates had moved through in 1891. The language used to describe those patients, hereditary defect, social burden, terminal type, was Galton's language, Prudence's language. She was not the beginning of the idea. She was not the end of it. She was a person through whom the idea moved into a specific community in the specific form of a schoolhouse and a locked desk drawer. The idea kept moving after she left. Opal Eustace was 56 years old in 1935. She had lived in Cincinnati for 22 years by then, which was longer than she had lived anywhere else, which meant, in the strange arithmetic of the migrant life, that Cincinnati was home now, whatever that meant. She had done well, by the measures that the society she'd been extracted into used to measure things. She'd graduated from Greenbrier Academy in 1899 with distinction. She'd taken a secretarial certificate. She'd worked for a law firm, then for a department store, then for a manufacturer's representative office, where she'd eventually moved into a bookkeeping role that used more of her mathematics than anyone at the office knew she had. She had a 2-room apartment on Ray Street. She had a cat, named after a creek she hadn't seen in 40 years. She had not gone back to Elk Creek Hollow. She had promised she would. In January of 1893, on the platform at Welch, crying into her mother's shoulder, she had promised she would come back every summer. She had gone back once in the summer of 1894, and then not again. The once had been enough to show her what she could not say to herself before she went, that she had become someone who didn't fit there anymore. Not entirely her fault. Not entirely anyone's fault. The product of a process that had begun in a 1-room schoolhouse with a teacher who believed she was doing something good. She had learned, eventually, about what had happened while she was at Greenbrier, about the November night, about the journal. Silas had written to her from Pittsburgh in 1904, a careful, factual letter that laid out the history, the way a surveyor lays out a plan, precisely, without editorial. She had read it twice and put it in the cedar chest where she kept things that were too heavy to display and too important to throw away. She had not written back for 3 months. When she did, the letter was short and careful and true. She said she was sorry she hadn't known. She said she was sorry she'd left. She said she wasn't sure she would have understood it, even if she'd known, at 12, what Prudence was doing. She'd been 12, and she'd believed in the woman who praised her, and gave her books, and told her she was worth something beyond the hollow. Silas had written back, "She wasn't wrong that you were worth something. She was wrong that the hollow wasn't." They wrote every year after that. Not often, but annually. It was not what they'd had, the closeness of children who share a bed and a world. But it was something. The thing that remained when most of what had been there was gone. Thomas she did not write about. There was nothing to write. She kept his birth date in her head the way you keep a wound's location, aware of it, not touching it directly. In the autumn of 1935, the Farm Security Administration's photography program sent Russell Lee to document poverty in McDowell County, West Virginia. He drove from Charleston in a government Ford with a view camera and a case of film plates and instructions to document conditions in the mining and logging communities of the southern coal fields. The timber was long gone by then. The great cutting wave that had begun in the 1880s had reached completion sometime around 1915, leaving behind denuded hillsides and silted creeks and communities that had briefly been boom towns and were now trying to survive on a combination of coal mining, subsistence agriculture, and the kind of determined human endurance that does not make headlines. Lee took hundreds of photographs over 2 weeks. He documented the face of poverty with the specific, clear-eyed compassion that characterized the FSA photographers at their best. He saw people, not symbols. He photographed carefully, with attention to light and composition and the human dignity of his subjects. One photograph became famous. A woman named Clara Deal, who was, as it happens, the granddaughter of the Granny Deal of this story, sat on the steps of a collapsed outbuilding with her 3 children, and Russell Lee's camera found her in a moment of stillness that managed to be both absolutely specific and absolutely universal. A woman, a hard life, the particular exhaustion that is specific to people who have been poor so long it has become the medium they move through. In the background, through the tree line, barely visible, was the sign. Yates School. Established 1891. The building had burned in 1910, a stove accident. Nobody hurt. And only the sign remained, nailed to what was left of the front post. By 1935 it was weathered to near illegibility. The letters faded to a whisper against gray wood. The photograph was published in several magazines. One of them was a national news publication with a large circulation. Opal Eustace bought this publication at a newsstand near her office on a Thursday afternoon in November 1935. She took it home. She made tea. She sat in her good chair by the window, the Cincinnati window, looking out at a row of brick buildings, at the November sky, and opened the magazine. She found the photograph on page 47. She did not recognize Clara Deal, whom she'd never met. She recognized the general shape of a McDowell County hollow, the steep ridgelines, the way the trees pressed in from every side. with a physical sensation that surprised her. A pull in the chest, the body remembering what the mind had worked to set aside. She almost put the magazine down. Then she looked more closely at the background, the tree line, something white against gray wood, letters. She brought the page closer to the window light. Yates School, established 1891. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Granny Deal, who had been dead for 28 years, and whose granddaughter was in this photograph, sitting on her collapsed steps. She thought about Silas in Pittsburgh, who would be 58 now, who wrote her every January. She thought about Thomas, who would have been 53 and was not. She thought about herself, sitting in the first row of the schoolhouse on a spring afternoon in 1891, tracing her finger along the map of Europe, asking a woman she trusted what Italy was like. She thought about the jar of preserved blackberries her mother had pressed into the teacher's hands on that first night, out of the specific mountain generosity that does not ask whether it is deserved. She put the magazine down on the side table. She did not pick it up again. The school closed in 1894. The building burned in 1910. The sign fell down sometime in the 1940s, and no one thought to preserve it, and it rotted in the brush line and returned to the earth it had been made from. Opal Justice died in Cincinnati in 1947. She left her apartment to a niece, one of Silas's daughters, and her cedar chest to the same. The cedar chest contained, among other things, her Greenbrier Academy graduation certificate, 3 photographs of people who no longer had names attached to them, a letter from Silas dated 1904, and a drawing on a piece of thick paper, careful and exact, of a one-room schoolhouse seen from outside, its windows lit from within, its chimney trailing smoke into a winter sky. She had kept it for 54 years. She'd never mentioned it to anyone. Silas Justice retired from his engineering firm in Pittsburgh in 1931 and lived another 14 years in a comfortable house in Squirrel Hill with his wife and their 2 children. His obituary in the Pittsburgh paper described him as a self-taught engineer who rose from humble Appalachian origins to make significant contributions to the region's infrastructure development. It did not mention the schoolteacher who had classified him as terminal at 14. It did not mention the engineering books that were taken away. It did not mention a boy doing gradient calculations by firelight in secret, because he had been told that mathematics was not for him, and had found this informative, but not ultimately convincing. Henry Vance lived in Raleigh County until his death in 1939. He became a schoolteacher himself, which is one of those facts that history offers without comment and leaves you to sit with. He taught in a mission school for 30 years. His father, Cephas, died in 1916 and is buried in the Elk Creek churchyard. The grave marker was placed by Henry. It reads, Cephas Vance, 1852 to 1916, a good man. Whether Henry chose those words because he meant them or because he was trying to say something he'd spent a lifetime not knowing how to say is not recorded. Granny Deal died in 1907. Her granddaughter Rachel kept the journal for 20 years and then gave it to the McDowell County Historical Society in Welch, which filed it in a folder of miscellaneous documents from the mission school era and forgot about it until a graduate student found it in 1978 and wrote a thesis that was read by 40 people. Giacomo Ferretti's brother Marco kept his letters, and Marco's daughter, Maria, kept them after that, and Maria's son donated them to the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies in Philadelphia in 1981. The letter about McDowell County is filed there. It is 4 pages long. The last paragraph reads, in translation from the Italian, "I do not know if what we did changed anything. The woman left. The damage was already done, in the way that ideas are always done before the person who carries them leaves. The idea stays. The person walks out, and you are left with the idea and no one to address it to. But I will tell you this. I have watched men sort other men all my life, in every country, in every language, for every reason they can invent. The reasons always sound different. The idea is always the same. And the people who are sorted out of the worth-developing category and into the worth-using category, they always know what has been done to them, even when they can't name it. They always know. That is the real experiment Prudence Yates ran in McDowell County, not whether her science was correct. It was not correct. But whether a community of people who are told they are worth less will believe it. The answer, more often than we would like, is yes. And the answer lasts much longer than the person who told them. The McDowell County of 1935, the poverty Russell Lee documented, was not entirely the product of one schoolteacher in one schoolhouse in the early 1890s. Let us be precise about that. The forces that shaped Appalachian poverty were systemic and enormous. The timber extraction that stripped the hillsides and left behind eroded land and silted creeks. The coal industry that took the mineral wealth out of the mountains and left behind black lung and boom and bust economies. The deliberate policy decisions that kept infrastructure investment low and educational resources scarce. The cultural condescension that had, for generations, told mountain people that their poverty was the product of their own character, rather than the product of deliberate economic choices made by people far away. Prudence Yates did not cause all of this. She was one vector through which an idea moved. But the idea that some people are born worth developing and others worth only using, that this sorting is scientific rather than political, that the people who do the sorting are doing civilization a service. That idea was not marginal in American life in the 1890s. It was mainstream. It was in the universities, in the mission reports, in the legal codes, in the Supreme Court opinions. It was the intellectual water of an age, and an educated woman who moved through that age absorbed it without knowing she was being shaped. The eugenics movement, the formal, organized, state-sponsored successor to the casual eugenics Prudence practiced in her classroom, sterilized approximately 60,000 Americans between 1907 and the 1970s. Disproportionately rural, disproportionately poor, disproportionately from exactly the kinds of communities she had moved through. The Buck versus Bell decision, which upheld this practice, has never been formally overturned. The last forced sterilization under state law in the United States occurred in 1981. These are not footnotes. These are the thing Prudence Yates was the local expression of. Her schoolhouse was small. The idea was very large. The division Prudence Yates carved into that community. Between those deemed worthy and those deemed not, that line never fully healed. Some would say it still hasn't. Not in Elk Creek Hollow specifically, which was swallowed by the timber industry, and then by the coal industry, and then by the long, slow recession that has made McDowell County, West Virginia, one of the most economically distressed counties in the United States. Not there specifically, but the idea travels. It always travels. It finds new language, new scientific frameworks, new institutional homes. It wears the clothes of whatever the current century considers progressive and rigorous and evidence-based. It speaks with authority, and it keeps a ledger, and it puts names in 2 columns, and it believes, completely, that it is helping. It is always helping. That is the story's lesson and its horror, laid side by side. The people who do the most damage in the name of education are often people who love education genuinely and sincerely, who believe in its power, who want, with real passion, to give children more than they had. They are just sorting while they do it. And the children who sit in the back rows of their systems know what is happening to them. They know, even when they can't name it. They carry it the way Silas carried it. Silently, in the interior compartment. Or the way Thomas carried it, closer to the surface, where it got in the way of things. The test of whether you believe a child is worth teaching is not what you write in a report to the mission board. It is what you write in the locked drawer. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that the history of Appalachia is full of people who came in from outside with ideas about what the mountains needed and what the people in them deserved. Some of those people were genuinely helpful. Some were extractive and knew it. And some were the hardest kind, the ones who genuinely believed they were helping while they were taking something that couldn't be given back. Prudence Yates is a composite character based on real patterns documented in the history of Presbyterian and Baptist mission school programs in Appalachia in the late 19th century. The eugenics ideology she practiced was real, was mainstream, and did reach into real classrooms. The Buck versus Bell decision was real. The Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded was real. The forced sterilization of Appalachian women and men was real, and it continued for decades after Prudence's fictional time in McDowell County. If you want to read more about the actual history of eugenics in Appalachia, I'll link below to some resources, including Anthony Platt's work on the intersections of race, class, and eugenics in American institutions, and Stephen Stoll's Ramp Hollow, which deals with the systematic dispossession of mountain communities in this exact era. Paul Lombardo's 3 Generations, No Imbeciles is the definitive account of Buck versus Bell and what led to it. The WPA photographs of McDowell County from the 1930s are in the Library of Congress collection and are freely available online. They are worth looking at, really looking at, not as symbols, but as specific people in specific places who had specific histories. The face in the photograph is not the face of poverty in the abstract. It is the face of a person who lived a life. The school closed in 1894. The line never fully healed. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave a comment if you have family connections to this period. I read everyone, and take care of yourselves and each other. This has been a dark corner of the Appalachian story. There are more to come. Yates School, East, 1891. The school closed in 1894. The building burned in 1910. But the division Prudence Yates carved into that community, between those deemed worthy and those deemed not, that line never fully healed. Some would say it still hasn't.